Today, a jury in Georgia found a father guilty of murder for giving his teenage son a gun, which the son then allegedly used in a deadly school shooting in 2024. CBS News correspondent Skylar Henry was in the courtroom as the verdict was read.
We, the jury, find the defendant guilty.
Colin Gray sat stone-faced as a jury found him guilty on all 27 counts. The jury took less than 2 hours to reach a verdict. Colin is the father of Colt Gray, the teen who allegedly shot and killed 4 people inside Apalachee High School, the deadliest school shooting in Georgia's history. Prosecutors say Gray's negligence led to the tragedy.
You just had to do one thing and take that rifle away.
While Gray insisted he never noticed any signs of trouble, the state charged that he ignored years of Colt's red flags. They argued Colin fueled the tragedy buying Colt the AR-15 style rifle used in the shooting for Christmas. Prosecutors played for the jury surveillance video from inside the school the day of the shooting. Colt is seen walking the hallways and concealing the rifle in his backpack in poster board. He then emerges from the bathroom and begins shooting into a classroom.
On the morning of September 4th, 2024, students arrived at school expecting another ordinary day. Backpacks dropped into lockers, teachers prepared their lessons, and the quiet routine of a small Georgia town moved forward just like it had countless times before. But before the morning would end, that routine would be shattered by gunfire. Inside Apalachee High School, panic spread through hallways as a 14-year-old student opened fire on classmates and teachers. When the chaos finally ended, 2 students and 2 teachers were dead, 7 others were wounded, and an entire community was left searching for answers. But the most shocking twist in this case didn't come from the shooting itself. It came months later inside a courtroom. Because prosecutors were not only trying the teenager who pulled the trigger, they were also putting his father on trial for murder. The question that stunned the country was simple but deeply unsettling. Could a parent be held responsible for a school shooting carried out by his own child? As investigators began to dig deeper into the events leading up to that tragic morning, disturbing details began to emerge, warnings that may have been overlooked, messages sent just moments before the attack, and a Christmas gift that prosecutors argued should never have been placed in the hands of a troubled teenager. By the time the trial began, the case had already become one of the most controversial criminal prosecutions in modern American history. And when the jury finally reached its decision, it would send a message that could change how school shootings are prosecuted across the United States forever. Because this wasn't just the story of a tragic school shooting. This was the story of a father accused of enabling it. And the verdict that followed would raise a haunting question for parents everywhere. Where does responsibility truly begin and where does it end? If you follow real crime stories and want more investigations like this one, take a moment to support the channel. Your engagement helps these stories reach more people who want to understand what really happened behind the headlines. What investigators would soon discover was that the tragedy at Apalachee High School did not begin on the morning of September 4th, 2024. In many ways, it began months earlier. Orwinda, Georgia is the kind of place where people often describe life as quiet and predictable. A small city northeast of Atlanta, it is a community where neighbors know one another, where Friday night football games fill the stands, and where schools are supposed to feel like the safest buildings in town. But on that Wednesday morning, everything changed. Students began arriving shortly after sunrise. The air still carried the warmth of late summer. Teenagers walked across the campus talking about homework, sports practice, and the usual small dramas of high school life. Teachers stood in their classrooms preparing for another day of lessons. No one inside the school could have imagined that within hours, those same hallways would become the center of one of the most disturbing criminal cases the state of Georgia had ever seen. And among the students arriving that morning was 14-year-old Colt Gray. To most people around him, Colt appeared like any other teenager moving quietly through the school day. But investigators would later learn that behind that quiet exterior was a young boy struggling with anger, isolation, and an obsession that had been growing stronger for months. An obsession with past school shootings. According to prosecutors, there had been warning signs, online searches, conversations about violent attacks, even concerns raised about the teenager's mental health. But those warnings had never turned into action strong enough to stop what was about to happen. The morning classes began like any other day. Teachers wrote assignments on the board, students took their seats. The normal sounds of a school day filled the building. Lockers opening, chairs scraping across classroom floors, quiet conversations between friends. And then, just after the school day was fully underway, the calm was shattered. Gunfire erupted inside the building. At first, many students didn't even recognize the sound. Some thought it might be something falling in a hallway, others assumed it was part of a school activity. But the sound came again, and then again. Within seconds, confusion turned into terror. Students began running through the hallways trying to escape the noise. Teachers rushed to lock classroom doors, pulling frightened teenagers away from windows and into corners of the room. Phones began buzzing with emergency alerts as teachers and students tried to understand what was happening. And some called their parents, others texted friends. Across the campus, fear spread rapidly as people realized something unthinkable was unfolding inside the school. Police would later say the shooter moved through parts of the school building, firing a semi-automatic rifle. That weapon, prosecutors would later reveal, was an AR-15 style rifle, and it had been given to the teenager months earlier. As the situation escalated, calls flooded into emergency dispatch centers across Barrow County. Police officers rushed toward the school while parents across the town began receiving terrifying messages from their children. Some texts were short and desperate. "Something is happening. There's a shooter. Please help." Within minutes, law enforcement vehicles surrounded the campus. Our officers entered the building, while frightened students continued to hide inside classrooms. The chaos lasted only a short time. But the damage had already been done. By the time police secured the school, 4 people were dead. 2 of them were students. 14-year-old Mason Schermerhorn had been killed in the attack. Another student, Christian Angulo, also just 14 years old, had lost his life. 2 teachers were also among the victims. Richard Aspinwall, a 39-year-old educator who had spent years working with students, was killed during the shooting. And Christina Irimi, a 53-year-old teacher known by colleagues as someone deeply committed to her students, also died that morning. 7 other people were injured. Across the campus, ambulances arrived as paramedics rushed victims to nearby hospitals. And outside the school, terrified parents gathered behind police barricades waiting for any information about their children. Some were reunited with their sons and daughters in tears. Others were not so fortunate. Inside the building, officers quickly located the suspect. The shooter was taken into custody. He did not attempt to escape. And according to investigators, what happened next would become one of the most haunting details of the entire case. Shortly before opening fire, Colt Gray had sent a message. Not to a friend, not to a classmate, but to his father. The text message was brief. "I'm sorry." Then another line followed. "It's not her fault." The message would later become a key piece of evidence in a trial that few people could have predicted. Because while the nation focused on the teenager who carried out the attack, investigators were already beginning to examine something else. Where did the gun come from? And how did a 14-year-old gain access to a weapon capable of causing such devastation inside a school? The answers would lead investigators straight to Colt's father, Colin Gray. In the days following the tragedy, police began examining the teenager's home life. They looked into the family's history, the weapons inside the house, and the circumstances that allowed the rifle to end up in the teenager's hands. What they discovered would soon become the center of a legal battle that would capture the attention of the entire country. According to prosecutors, the rifle used in the attack had been given to Colin Gray as a gift, a Christmas present. The revelation shocked many people across the United States. How could a teenager so young have access to such a weapon? And more importantly, had warning signs been ignored? Investigators began reviewing the months leading up to the shooting. What they found painted a troubling picture. Prosecutors later argued that Colt had shown a growing fascination with previous school shootings. They pointed to conversations and behavior that suggested the teenager was deeply interested in past attacks. They also examined concerns about the teenager's mental health, and they began asking a difficult question. Should his father have seen this coming? As the investigation expanded, prosecutors concluded that the tragedy was not only the result of one teenager's decision, they believed it was also the result of negligence. In their view, Colin Gray had failed in a fundamental responsibility, keeping a dangerous weapon out of his child's hands. But the father told a very different story. When questioned about the rifle, Colin Gray explained that the weapon was meant for recreational activities, hunting trips, target practice at a shooting range. He insisted that he had never imagined his son would use it for violence. According to Gray, he believed his son was simply learning a hobby many families in rural parts of Georgia shared. He told investigators that he had never seen the teenager as capable of carrying out a school shooting. The idea, he said, had seemed impossible. But as evidence continued to emerge, the investigation was moving in a direction that would eventually lead to something almost unheard of in American criminal law. Prosecutors began considering charges against the father himself. For many legal experts, the idea was controversial. Traditionally, criminal responsibility for school shootings fell entirely on the person who committed the attack. But in this case, investigators believed the story didn't end with the teenager who pulled the trigger. They believed the events leading to the shooting, the access to the weapon, the alleged warning signs, the failure to secure the rifle, were all part of a chain that could have been broken if someone had intervened sooner. As the case developed, another voice emerged in the investigation. The teenager's mother, Marcy Gray. She and Colin Gray had been separated at the time of the shooting, but during the legal proceedings that followed, she would testify that she had previously urged the father to remove the guns from the teenager's access. Her testimony suggested that concerns about the teenager's behavior had existed inside the family. Concerns that prosecutors argued should have been taken more seriously. By the time the criminal case moved forward, the tragedy in Winder had already become one of the most widely discussed school shootings in recent years. But what made the story even more extraordinary was what happened next. For the first time in Georgia history, prosecutors decided to pursue murder charges not only against the teenager who carried out the attack, but against his father as well. And when the courtroom doors finally opened months later, the question facing the jury would not only be about what happened inside the school that morning, it would be about everything that happened before it. Because the prosecution believed the shooting was preventable. And they were prepared to argue that the responsibility for the tragedy did not rest with one person alone. It rested with the parent, who they claimed had the power to stop it. What followed inside that courtroom would become one of the most controversial trials in modern American criminal law, a case that would test the boundaries of parental responsibility, and ultimately ask a question that jurors would have to answer carefully. Was Colin Gray guilty of enabling the very tragedy that destroyed so many lives, or was he simply a father whose child made an unthinkable choice? That question would soon be placed before 12 jurors, and their decision would echo far beyond the walls of the courtroom. That by the time the trial began, the tragedy in Winder, Georgia, had already shaken the country. But what unfolded inside the courtroom would transform the case into something far bigger than a single school shooting. Because for the first time in Georgia's history, a father was being prosecuted for murder in connection with a mass shooting carried out by his own child. When Colin Gray walked into the courtroom, the atmosphere was heavy with tension. Families of the victims sat quietly behind the prosecution table, while reporters filled nearly every available seat. Outside the courthouse, cameras from national news organizations waited for any development. Inside, the jury was about to hear a case unlike any they had seen before. The prosecution's argument was clear from the beginning. This tragedy, they said, was not simply the result of a teenager making a terrible decision. It was the result of a series of preventable failures that led directly to the moment when a 14-year-old student carried a rifle into Apalachee High School and opened fire on his classmates and teachers. According to prosecutors, those failures began at home. The state argued that Colin Gray had provided his son, Colt Gray, with access to a powerful semi-automatic rifle, the very weapon used in the attack. But it wasn't just the presence of the gun that concerned investigators. It was the warnings that may have come before it. Prosecutors told the jury that the teenager had shown an unusual fascination with past school shootings. Investigators had discovered that Colt had studied previous attacks and had become deeply interested in the details of how they happened. The prosecution argued that these were not harmless curiosities. They were red flags, and according to the state, those red flags should have been impossible for a parent to ignore. During the trial, jurors listened as investigators described how the rifle used in the attack had entered the teenager's life. It had been given to him as a gift, a Christmas present. The revelation had shocked many people across the country when it first became public, but hearing the details in court made the moment even more unsettling. The weapon, prosecutors explained, was an AR-15 style rifle, a firearm capable of firing rapidly and causing devastating injuries. In the courtroom, prosecutors carefully walked the jury through the timeline leading up to the shooting. They described how the teenager had been struggling emotionally in the months before the attack. Concerns about his mental health had surfaced, and people close to the family had noticed changes in his behavior. According to the prosecution, these changes were warning signs that demanded immediate attention. Instead, they argued, the teenager was allowed continued access to firearms. Prosecutors said that decision would ultimately have deadly consequences. As the state presented its case, jurors also heard testimony from someone who had been very close to the situation, the teenager's mother, Marcy Gray. Marcy Gray and Colin Gray had been separated at the time of the shooting, but during the trial, she took the stand and described conversations she said had taken place before the tragedy. According to her testimony, she had urged the father to take away the teenager's guns. She had been worried. In court, she explained that she believed removing the weapons from the house might help prevent something terrible from happening. Her words carried a heavy weight inside the courtroom. If those warnings had been taken seriously, some wondered, could the tragedy have been avoided? But the defense strongly pushed back against the prosecution's narrative. Colin Gray's lawyers told the jury that the state was trying to do something unprecedented, holding a father criminally responsible for a crime committed by his son. They argued that the teenager had acted independently, and that no parent could fully predict or control the choices their child might make. The defense also emphasized that firearms are common in many parts of Georgia, especially in rural communities where hunting and shooting sports are widely practiced. According to the defense team, The rifle was intended for recreational use, hunting trips, target practice, activities that many families across the region participate in every year. They argued that Colin Gray believed the gun would be used responsibly and that he had never imagined his son would take it into a school. As the trial continued, jurors heard directly from the father himself. Taking the witness stand, Colin Gray spoke about his life as a parent raising 3 children. His voice, at times, was described as emotional. He acknowledged that his son had struggled with mental health challenges. When asked about those struggles, he told the court something that would later be repeated across national news coverage. "I could have done better." The statement appeared to reflect regret. But Gray also insisted that he never believed his son was capable of the kind of violence that unfolded inside the school. He told jurors that the rifle had clear rules attached to it. According to Gray, he had explained to his son that the weapon was only for use at a shooting range or during hunting trips. The father maintained that the gun was not intended to be used in any other setting, but prosecutors challenged that explanation. They argued that the responsibility of owning a firearm goes beyond explaining rules. It includes making absolutely certain that the weapon cannot fall into the wrong hands, especially when the person living in the same house is a minor. As the trial unfolded, prosecutors also revealed a chilling detail that had emerged during the investigation. Just before the shooting began, Colin Gray had sent a text message. The message was directed to his father. It read, "I'm sorry." Then another line followed, "It's not her fault." When investigators first discovered the message, it immediately raised questions. Was the teenager acknowledging responsibility, or was he trying to shield his father from blame? In court, prosecutors suggested that the message revealed something else entirely. They argued it showed that the teenager understood the gravity of what he was about to do, and that he knew the consequences would reach far beyond the school walls. The courtroom remained silent as jurors considered the evidence. Because the case before them was not simply about what happened on September 4th, it was about everything that led to that day, the decisions made inside a home, the warnings that may have gone unaddressed, the access to a weapon that prosecutors believed should never have been available, and the difficult question that would soon face the jury. Was the father legally responsible for the deaths that followed? Legal experts across the country watched the trial closely. Many understood that whatever verdict the jury reached could reshape how future school shooting cases are prosecuted. If Colin Gray was convicted, it could signal a major shift in how the justice system views parental responsibility. But if he was acquitted, it might reinforce the long-standing legal principle that individuals are responsible for their own crimes. For the families of the victims, however, the legal arguments were only part of the story. Their focus remained on the 4 lives that had been lost inside the school. 4 people who had arrived at school that morning expecting an ordinary day. Students who had plans for the future. Teachers who had dedicated their careers to educating young people. The courtroom testimony brought those losses into sharp focus. Jurors were reminded again and again of the names that had become central to the case: Mason Schermerhorn, Christian Angulo, Richard Aspinwall, Christina Irimi, or 4 lives that would never return to the classrooms of Apalachee High School. As the trial entered its final phase, both sides prepared their closing arguments. Prosecutors reminded jurors that the case was about responsibility. They argued that a parent who provides a firearm to a troubled teenager cannot ignore the risks. The defense responded with a different message. They warned the jury that convicting Colin Gray would create a dangerous precedent, punishing a father for a crime he did not personally commit. The jury listened carefully to both sides. Then they were sent to deliberate. The question before them was simple to ask, but incredibly difficult to answer. Was Colin Gray guilty of enabling the tragedy that occurred at Apalachee High School? Or was he a father who had already lost everything to a decision made by his own son? The answer would soon arrive, and when it did, it would take less time than almost anyone expected. When the jury left the courtroom to begin deliberations, the atmosphere inside the courthouse shifted almost immediately. For weeks, the trial had moved through testimony, evidence, and emotional arguments from both sides. Every detail of the tragedy at Apalachee High School had been examined carefully. Now, everything came down to 12 people sitting in a quiet room behind closed doors. The question before them carried enormous weight. Was Colin Gray criminally responsible for the actions of his son? Or had prosecutors gone too far by trying to hold a parent accountable for a crime committed by a teenager? Across the courthouse, while the families of the victims waited anxiously, many of them had sat through every day of testimony. They had listened as witnesses described the moment gunfire erupted inside the school, and they had heard the arguments about what might have prevented it. For them, the trial was never just about legal precedent. It was about the 4 lives that had been lost, 2 students who would never return to class, 2 teachers who would never again stand in front of their classrooms. As the jury deliberated, reporters gathered outside the courthouse, preparing for what could become one of the most consequential verdicts in modern American criminal law. Legal analysts across the country watched closely. Some believed the prosecution had presented a compelling case that the father's negligence played a role in the tragedy. Others argued that the justice system was entering dangerous territory by attempting to criminalize parenting decisions. But while the debate unfolded across television screens and social media, the jury was focused on something much simpler: the evidence. They reviewed the timeline of events leading up to the shooting. They examined the details surrounding the rifle used in the attack, a semi-automatic AR-15 style weapon that prosecutors said had been given to the teenager as a Christmas gift. They considered testimony about the teenager's behavior in the months before the shooting. They remembered the warnings that had been discussed in court, and they revisited the haunting text message sent shortly before the attack began. "I'm sorry. It's not her fault." Those words had lingered in the courtroom ever since they were introduced as evidence. To some, they sounded like a teenager accepting responsibility for his own actions. To others, they raised deeper questions about what he believed his father might face once the shooting was over. For the jurors, interpreting those words was only one part of a much larger puzzle. They also had to consider the testimony from the teenager's mother, Marcy Gray, who told the court she had urged the father to remove the guns from the house before the tragedy occurred. They reviewed the statements made by investigators who described the teenager's growing fascination with past school shootings, and they listened again to the father's own words when he took the stand. "What if I could have done better?" The statement had been delivered quietly in the courtroom. For some observers, it sounded like regret. For others, it raised the painful question of whether that realization had come too late. Hours passed. Then something unexpected happened. The jury sent a message to the judge. They had reached a verdict. The announcement surprised nearly everyone in the courtroom. The trial had lasted weeks, and the case involved complicated legal arguments that many experts believed could require days of deliberation. Instead, the jury had come to a decision in less than 2 hours. As people slowly returned to their seats inside the courtroom, the tension was impossible to ignore. The families of the victims sat together waiting quietly. Across the room, Colin Gray sat beside his attorneys. Moments later, the jury filed back into the courtroom. The judge asked the foreperson if a verdict had been reached. Yes. The clerk then began reading the decision. Guilty. The word echoed through the courtroom. Then it came again. Guilty. The jury had found Colin Gray guilty on all charges. 2 counts of second-degree murder for the deaths of students Mason Schermerhorn and Christian Angulo. 2 counts of involuntary manslaughter for the deaths of teachers Richard Aspinwall and Christina Irimi. And an additional conviction for reckless conduct. The courtroom remained silent as the verdict was read. For the families of the victims, the moment carried a complicated mixture of emotions. Relief that the legal process had reached a conclusion, grief that no verdict could ever bring their loved ones back. Across the room, Colin Gray stood quietly as the reality of the decision settled in. Under Georgia law, the convictions meant he now faced the possibility of life in prison. Sentencing would come later. But the message delivered by the jury was already clear. In their view, the father had played a role in enabling the tragedy that unfolded inside the school. Outside the courthouse, the verdict quickly became national news. Legal experts began discussing what the decision might mean for the future of criminal law in the United States. For decades, parents had rarely been prosecuted in connection with crimes committed by their children. But this case, along with the earlier convictions of the parents involved in the Oxford High School shooting, signaled that the legal landscape might be changing. Prosecutors across the country were watching closely. Some believed the verdict would encourage more aggressive investigations into how minors gain access to firearms. Others worried that the precedent could create legal uncertainty about where parental responsibility begins and ends. But beyond the legal debate, the tragedy in Winder remained deeply personal for the community that had experienced it. At Apalachee High School, students eventually returned to the classrooms where the shooting had occurred. Teachers resumed their lessons. But the memory of that morning remained impossible to forget. 4 empty spaces in a school community served as a permanent reminder of what had happened. Meanwhile, the teenager who carried out the attack still faced his own legal battle. Colt Gray was charged with 55 criminal counts, including malice murder and felony murder. He pleaded not guilty. His trial would be held separately, and it promised to reopen many of the same painful questions about how the tragedy unfolded. But the conviction of Colin Gray had already changed the conversation surrounding school shootings in America. It forced communities to ask difficult questions about accountability, about warning signs, about the responsibilities parents carry when firearms exist inside a home, and about the decisions that might prevent future tragedies before they ever begin. Because in the end, the story of Apalachee High School was not only about the moment the gunfire started, it was about everything that happened before it, the warnings, the choices, the opportunities to intervene, and the painful realization that sometimes the most devastating tragedies are the ones that might have been prevented. If this story helped you understand the deeper truth behind cases like this, take a moment to subscribe to the channel and support the work we're doing here. These investigations are not told to sensationalize tragedy, but to uncover the facts behind real events so more people can recognize warning signs and learn from them. By subscribing and engaging with the video, you help these important stories reach more viewers and ensure the voices and memories of the victims are never forgotten.